The air was thick with tension, the kind that hangs over a battlefield just before the chaos erupts. Amid the dust and debris of a once thriving alien city, a young girl lay motionless on the cracked ground. Her skin was a pale shade of blue, tinged with the scars of countless battles, her delicate limbs twisted at odd angles. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, each one more labored than the last. Around her, the sounds of conflict raged on, as if the universe had no interest in sparing this alien girl's life. But to those who watched from the shadows, there was something more important than the battle for territory or supremacy. There was a question that needed answering. Would anyone care enough to save her? She had been an outsider since birth, a child of a race feared and misunderstood by those who called the stars their home. Her species had been the target of countless hunts, captured and discarded by countless enemies. Yet, she had survived until now. She had fought to survive in a world that had never wanted her, always believing there might be a future for her, even when the universe seemed to reject her existence. But now, lying on the battlefield, bruised and broken, she wondered if anyone would ever give her that chance again. Her vision blurred as she tried to focus on her surroundings. The alien city, once full of life, now looked like a graveyard. Smoke billowed from distant structures, fires ravaging what was left of her people's legacy. The ground was slick with the blood of her comrades, and yet no one seemed to notice her. Her people, if you could still call them that, had long since abandoned her for their own survival. The enemy was relentless, and in a moment like this, the strong had to fend for themselves. It was every species for itself in the galaxy, and no one had ever taught her any different. But just as her mind began to slip into unconsciousness, something unusual happened. A shadow fell across her form, blocking out the fading sunlight. She tried to lift her head but could barely focus, her vision swimming with darkness. Whoever this was, they weren't from her planet. Their steps were too measured, too careful, unlike the chaotic clamor of battle that had consumed her world. A human stood before her, a medic, she realized through the haze of pain. His uniform was simple, but practical, nothing like the ornate battle gear of the alien soldiers she had seen time and time again. He knelt beside her with a calmness that didn't belong in such a violent environment. His hands were steady as they moved, assessing her injuries, his expression unreadable but determined. The girl felt a flicker of hope in her chest, but she quickly pushed it away. She had learned long ago not to expect help from anyone, least of all a human. The humans, the ones her people had often considered beneath them, were now the ones she could only pray would show her mercy. In this cold, indifferent universe, compassion had always been a rare commodity, and no one had ever been kind to her kind. But still, the human worked without hesitation, pulling out medical supplies from his pack and expertly working to stop the bleeding on her leg, applying pressure to the wound as she struggled to keep her eyes open. The pain was intense, sharper than anything she had ever felt, but it wasn't the pain that made her heart race, it was the fact that he was doing this at all. No one had ever cared enough to save her, to give her a second chance. They had always seen her as a threat, a potential weapon, or simply as a lesser being. But this human, this medic was different. He didn't look at her with the same fear or disdain the others had shown. There was only one emotion in his eyes, concern. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft but firm, as if speaking to someone who had been through much more than she could imagine. "I've got you. Just hold on a little longer." The alien girl's breath hitched. Could she trust him? Would he actually save her, Or was this just another cruel illusion, a fleeting moment of hope before the universe once again proved how unforgiving it truly was? The medic glanced up, as if sensing her hesitation, his expression softening. "You're not alone," he said quietly, his words cutting through the chaos around them. "I'm not leaving you here." But the tension of the battlefield loomed, and the medic wasn't alone in this war zone. More soldiers, humans, aliens, mercenaries, were still fighting, some of them drawing closer. The girl felt her pulse quicken as the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions neared, the violence of the world beginning to encroach on the fragile moment of kindness that had been offered to her. The medic's actions were slow, deliberate. He wasn't just treating a wound. He was buying time, possibly at the cost of his own life. It was a gamble, and the alien girl could sense the urgency in his movements. He worked quickly, his every action calculated, but he knew that time was slipping away. The sounds of the ongoing battle weren't far behind them. Even now, the horizon burned with the aftermath of war. Was this his plan? To help her and risk his own life in the process? She could sense his determination, but she also knew how ruthless the enemy could be. "Stay with me," he urged, voice soft but filled with purpose. "You're going to make it." The girl closed her eyes, exhaustion threatening to claim her. Her body screamed in pain, but her mind, her instincts, those told her to stay awake. There was something in his voice, something in his touch that convinced her, just for a moment, that maybe she wasn't entirely alone in this universe. But before she could say anything, a loud roar of engines cut through the air, signaling the arrival of reinforcements. Her eyes snapped open as a distant ship loomed on the horizon. More soldiers, enemy soldiers. More battle, more destruction. And the medic, would he survive? Was this all some cruel twist of fate? Or had she stumbled into a moment of mercy in the middle of a war? The girl's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to sit up, panic creeping in. She was barely able to move, her strength ebbing away by the second. Her thoughts were clouded with fear and confusion. But beneath it all, there was still a small glimmer of hope. A hope that this human medic, this one man, in the midst of an unforgiving war, might be the only one who could help her when no one else would. But time was running out. The moment of kindness might soon be over. What would happen next? Would the medic survive? Would the girl get the chance to repay the kindness that had been shown to her? Or would the battlefield claim them both? The tension was thick, and the question remained, how far would the medic go to save her, and could he truly be trusted in a world where no one had ever shown such compassion before? The story was only beginning. The roar of engines grew louder, and the medic's expression tightened, his brow furrowing as he glanced back over his shoulder. The alien girl could barely lift her head, but she could sense the danger drawing closer. The distant ship's silhouette sharpened in the horizon, its purpose clear. It was not here for help. It was here to claim more lives, to finish what the war had started. The medic's movements grew quicker, more frantic, as he tightened the bandages around her leg, doing what he could to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me," he said again, his voice almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of urgency. He wasn't just speaking to calm her, he was telling himself the same thing. The situation was spiraling, and every second counted. Her vision blurred, a mix of pain and fear, fogging her thoughts. She tried to push through the haze, but it felt like the world was slipping away. Her thoughts scattered like fragments of glass, broken and sharp. Yet in those fleeting moments of clarity, something struck her. There was something different about this human. Most would have abandoned her by now. Most would have seen her as nothing more than a casualty in a war that didn't concern them. But this man, he was risking everything, even his life, to help someone like her. It didn't make sense. She was nothing more than an alien girl, an outcast, a target in this endless war between species. And yet, here he was, kneeling beside her, treating her wounds with a level of care that she had never known. As she stared at his face, the lines of exhaustion etched into his features, she felt an unfamiliar emotion stir within her trust. It was something she had never been allowed to have. She had grown up with the understanding that trust was a luxury, something reserved for the strong, the powerful, the dominant species. And she had always been a tool, a weapon, a means to an end. To survive was to rely on no one but herself. But this human, he was different. She couldn't explain it, but she felt the pull of his actions, his determination to save her. Yet, despite his calm exterior, she noticed the tension in his every movement. His eyes darted nervously back to the ship, calculating the distance, weighing his options. She could see the conflict playing out within him. He had a decision to make: help her and face the consequences, or leave her behind and survive. It wasn't an easy choice. The war around them was brutal, and the enemy soldiers had no mercy for anyone caught in their path, especially not someone like her. She was a remnant of a dying race, a casualty in a war that had already been decided. The thought of dying here, in the dirt and smoke, seemed inevitable, but the humans' refusal to give up on her made her question that certainty. The ship was getting closer. It was unmistakable now, a sleek, military-grade vessel with sharp edges and ominous markings. The insignia was foreign to her, but its meaning was clear. This was an enemy ship, and the soldiers aboard would stop at nothing to ensure their victory. The medic knew that too. He could feel the weight of their approach pressing down on him, but still he didn't falter in his actions. His hands moved with steady precision, applying pressure to her wounds, checking her vitals, ensuring she wouldn't bleed out before help arrived. But there was no help coming. She knew that. The medic, though determined, was alone. The battle around them was chaos, with explosions rocking the distant buildings and soldiers firing in all directions. Even if someone were to come to their aid, it wouldn't be in time. This was a fight that had no winners, only survivors. And yet, the medic refused to act like a survivor. He acted as if his life wasn't as important as hers, as if saving her mattered more than getting to safety. She couldn't understand it. "You're going to be okay," he reassured her again, though the uncertainty in his voice was palpable. His gaze lifted to the horizon as the enemy ship neared. He could hear the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on the dirt as soldiers disembarked from the ship, their weapons drawn. The medic's jaw tightened. He knew what they would do when they found her. No one would show mercy. No one would care about her life. But he did. The alien girl's mind swam in and out of consciousness, but something kept her tethered to the present. It was the way the medic held her gaze, the way he seemed so resolute, as if he believed that, despite everything, they still had a chance. The fight that raged around them seemed almost surreal now, a distant backdrop to the quiet connection between them. In this moment, it wasn't about the war or the battle. It was about life, and the simple act of one human refusing to let another die. Suddenly, the sharp crackle of an approaching voice pierced the tension. "Medic, get out of there. The situation is compromised. We can't hold them off much longer." The voice crackled over a communicator, muffled and filled with static, But the message was clear. The medic had no time to save her. He had to leave. He had to get out. The enemy soldiers were closing in, and his comrades, if he had any. The medic didn't move. He didn't hesitate. His focus never wavered from her. "I'm not leaving her," he said firmly, his voice low but unwavering. His decision was made. The alien girl's heart raced. She had never been shown such compassion. Never in her life had anyone been willing to risk so much for her. She had always been a tool, a weapon. Her race had always been seen as something to be feared, to be destroyed. But here, in the chaos of war, there was a human medic who had made a choice to save her. And it made her wonder, was there more to survival than just living through the battles? Was there something to be gained in the struggle for compassion? As the enemy soldiers closed in, the medic's voice was the only thing that anchored her. "I'm not going to let you die. Stay with me." But the distant sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. They were here. The enemy was on the verge of finding them. The medic's actions were becoming more frantic. Now he was closing the wound on her leg. But his eyes flickered to the horizon, scanning for an escape route, a chance to get her out of there. The alien girl, her body weak and her mind struggling to keep her awake, realized the truth. The medic was fighting for her, not because she was important, not because her race mattered, but because he believed in something more than just survival. In the midst of war, where most would have given up, he chose to care. And for the first time, she wasn't alone. But the clock was ticking, and the enemy was almost upon them. Would the medic's courage be enough to carry them through? Could they escape, or was this their last stand? The tension was unbearable, and the answers, for now, remained just out of reach. The sound of the enemy's footsteps grew louder, a steady rhythm that echoed through the crumbling remains of the city. Each step was a countdown, each one dragging them closer to the inevitable. The medic's eyes darted back to the girl as his hands moved with increasing urgency. The blood had slowed, but the damage was severe. She could feel the pressure against her wounds, his steady touch, but his eyes, those eyes betrayed the worry that was beginning to gnaw at him. He was doing everything he could, but it wasn't enough. Time was slipping away. Her breath was shallow, her body trembling not just from the cold, but from the growing panic inside her chest. The thought of being abandoned here, on the brink of death, was more terrifying than anything she had ever faced before. It wasn't the enemy soldiers who terrified her most. Now it was the looming realization that, despite his best efforts, the medic might not be able to save her. She wasn't just an alien girl, a casualty of war. She was a dying cause. But somehow, as his fingers tightened around the bandages, a flicker of hope lingered, faint but real. He hadn't given up on her. Could she dare to believe it? The medic's voice broke through the silence, steady but filled with tension. "Stay with me. You're not dying here." His words were a promise, but the way his eyes flicked to the horizon where the enemy soldiers were getting closer betrayed the truth. The situation was critical. He had no idea how much longer he could hold them off, or if there was even a way out of this. The girl's heart pounded in her chest as she fought to stay conscious. Her thoughts were a blur, torn between fear and confusion, unable to focus on anything but the medic. The sudden realization hit her harder than any injury she had ever suffered. He wasn't just trying to save her life. He was defying everything that her people had ever stood for. The alien girl had always been taught that survival meant using others, sacrificing them when necessary. But here was a human, risking everything for her. It made no sense. It defied everything she knew. The noise of the approaching enemy intensified. Gunshots rang out in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots crunching through rubble. The soldiers were near. Too close. Too close. The medic's gaze was focused on the girl now, his hands moving with lightning speed as he tried to stabilize her. But even as he worked, his movements grew more frantic. The hope he had tried to instill in her was slipping, just like his control over the situation. He paused for a moment, his breath steadying as he took a quick glance over his shoulder, trying to gauge the distance. The enemy soldiers were within striking range. Now there was no time left. The medic's eyes flickered toward the horizon, calculating the risk of staying versus the possibility of a retreat. His decision was made, but it wasn't an easy one. The ship they had heard earlier was closing in, and the reinforcements would be arriving soon. It wasn't just him at risk. Now, it was both of their lives. He glanced back at her, his face softening even as the weight of the situation seemed to press him down. "I won't leave you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But even as he spoke, the sounds of the enemy's advance were undeniable. They were almost here. The girl's mind raced, her body screaming in protest, yet she couldn't ignore the urgency in his voice. She wanted to ask him why. Why was he doing this for her? Why did he risk his life for someone like her? But the words wouldn't come. It was too much. The pain, the fear, it clouded everything. She had learned to live without kindness, without compassion. She had learned to trust only in herself. But this human medic had shattered that lesson in a matter of moments. Suddenly, there was a flash of movement. Shadows darted across the horizon, the silhouettes of enemy soldiers breaking through the smoke. The medic's hands stilled for a moment. His calm exterior had cracked, revealing the intense urgency beneath. "We have to move," he said, his voice no longer as steady, his hands shaking as he reached for her. But the alien girl could barely sit up. Her body refused to respond, and her strength was almost gone. The medic looked at her, the panic creeping into his eyes as he tried to support her, pulling her toward him as gently as possible. He cursed under his breath, trying to find a way to make her move faster, but the girl couldn't help him. Her body was betraying her, and with each passing second, she could feel the darkness closing in. The enemy soldiers were nearly upon them now, their voices sharp, demanding, filled with the cruel efficiency of warriors who had long since lost the humanity that the medic had shown her. She could hear the faint hum of their weapons powering up, and her heart skipped a beat. There was no escape, no way out. This was the end. But then, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath them trembled. A low, rumbling sound filled the air. The medic froze, eyes wide, as the source of the tremor became clear. From behind a pile of rubble, a figure emerged, another human. The figure was wearing a similar uniform to the medic's, but this one carried a large, armored weapon. It was clear the newcomer had no intention of negotiating with the enemy. "Move," the new human shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Without waiting for a response, he aimed the weapon at the enemy soldiers and fired. The sound of gunfire was deafening, the shockwave knocking the girl back onto the ground, her breath escaping in a rush. The medic moved quickly, pulling her out of the line of fire, his hands gripping her tightly as they both tried to take cover behind the wreckage. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The enemy soldiers hesitated, momentarily disoriented by the sudden assault, and the medic seized the opportunity. "We have to move now," he urged, pulling the alien girl to her feet with surprising strength. The girl could barely stand, her legs trembling beneath her, but she managed to stay on her feet as the two humans led her to safety. There was no time to think, no time to question what was happening. Her body was heavy, her senses dulled, but for the first time, she felt something close to relief. A chance. A small, fragile chance at survival. But the enemy was still close, and the final battle was only just beginning. The medic's hands were shaking as he dragged the alien girl through the wreckage, each step feeling like it took an eternity. The distant crackle of gunfire still echoed in the air, but they were moving fast now, hidden behind collapsed walls and shattered structures. The new human, the one who had appeared out of nowhere with that imposing weapon, was covering their rear, his movements quick and precise, firing off shots to keep the enemy at bay. The medic's heart was pounding in his chest, but there was no time for relief. Not yet. They'd only made it a few meters before the enemy regrouped. Then, just as the medic was about to pull the alien girl into a safer alleyway, a sudden burst of light split the air. A brilliant flash from behind them, an explosion, powerful enough to throw the medic off balance, sending both him and the girl to the ground. Dirt and debris filled the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to dissolve into chaos. The medic gasped, struggling to get to his feet as the world spun around him. His vision swam, his ears ringing from the blast, and his first instinct was to check on the girl. She was there, but her body was limp, her face pale as she struggled to breathe, the weight of the explosion knocking the breath out of her. His heart lurched. He had to act quickly, but as he tried to move closer, his hand hovered above her. The explosion hadn't just thrown them off course, it had changed the battlefield entirely. The blast had exposed them, and now the enemy was closing in faster than before. Their footsteps were loud and deliberate, their presence undeniable. The medic cursed under his breath, turning to the newcomer for guidance. But to his horror, the man who had been covering them was no longer in sight. There was no sign of him, no sound of his footsteps. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Panic gripped the medic's chest as he scanned the area, but there was no trace of the soldier, not even a hint of his weapon's silhouette in the distance. The blast had thrown them off course in more ways than one, and now the medic was alone, with no idea how to proceed. The alien girl stirred slightly, her head lolling as she tried to open her eyes. What happened? Her voice was weak, strained. The medic tried to steady his breath, his mind racing. "Stay down," he urged, trying to keep his voice steady. But he could feel the urgency creeping into his words. "We need to move. We can't stay here." She shook her head, her fingers gripping his arm weakly. "They know. They're already here." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to send a chill down the medic's spine. He knew she was right. There was no more time to plan. The enemy was right on their tail, and the medic realized that retreating further into the ruins might not be an option anymore. The alleyways they had been trying to use for cover were starting to fill with the sound of heavy footsteps, the unmistakable clank of enemy armor, and the sharp crack of weapons being readied for use. The medic's mind spun with thoughts of what to do, where to go, how to get out alive. But in the midst of it all, one disturbing thought kept looping in his head. Who was the enemy, really? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden crackling noise. A voice, distorted and urgent, came through his communicator. "Medic, this is command. We've received intel. The situation has escalated. The soldiers coming for you, they're not just regular enemies. They're specialists. Elite forces." The medic froze. His chest tightened, and the words echoed in his mind. Elite forces. That wasn't just a group of regular soldiers. Those were the top of the chain. the ones trained for operations like this. They were fast, ruthless, and relentless. The stakes had just been raised higher than he could have imagined. "Command, do you have any other information? Any way out?" The medic's voice was rough, the words scraping his throat as the pressure mounted. There was a pause on the other end. Then the voice crackled back through the static. "No response from the evac team. You're on your own. Do what you can to stay alive. The enemy has resources we can't track. You're on your own." Out. The line went dead. The medic's heart raced. His eyes darted around, desperate for a way out, but every direction seemed like a dead end. His body was starting to feel the strain of everything, the running, the panic, the adrenaline that had been coursing through him for hours. The alien girl's breathing was growing more labored, and he couldn't afford to waste any more time. But now, with the knowledge that they were being hunted by an elite team, every move he made felt like a misstep, a mistake waiting to happen. The enemy was closing in on them from all sides. The only option left was to go further into the ruins, into the heart of the city, where the streets were nothing but a maze of broken buildings and half-destroyed roads. It wasn't an ideal choice. It was a gamble, but it was the only chance they had left. But just as the medic was about to pull the girl up, ready to move, something strange happened. The ground beneath them trembled once again, but this time it wasn't just an explosion or the result of heavy machinery. No, this was different. This was a vibration familiar, almost intentional. Then the unmistakable sound of more footsteps, but this time they were lighter, more precise, more controlled. A figure stepped into view, a silhouette in the smoke, taller and more imposing than any soldier he had seen before. As the figure moved closer, the medic's heart skipped a beat. There was something unnatural about the way the figure moved, almost as if it was gliding rather than walking. The figure's outline shimmered for a brief moment, the air around it warping slightly as if reality itself was bending in its presence. It wasn't human. The figure, though cloaked in dark armor, had an aura of inhuman power. And as it neared, the medic's stomach dropped. This was no ordinary enemy soldier. This was something far worse. And in that moment, the medic knew they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something much bigger. The air around them crackled with tension as the figure drew closer. The medic's heart pounded in his chest, and for a split second, it felt as though the world had frozen. The figure's unnatural movement sent chills down his spine, its presence unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just the physical intimidation, it was the sense that this being, whatever it was, could end them with the flick of a hand. The alien girl stirred weakly, her eyes blinking in confusion as she tried to focus on the figure, but the medic couldn't afford to wait for her to comprehend. He had to act. Instinct kicked in. His hand gripped the rifle slung over his shoulder, his fingers trembling as he checked the ammo, his mind already calculating their options. But as the figure continued to approach, an overwhelming feeling of hopelessness began to wash over him. The soldiers had been bad enough, but this wasn't just an enemy soldier. It was something else, something beyond what the medic had prepared for. Without warning, the figure spoke, its voice low and smooth, yet strangely mechanical. "You can't run from this, human. You've stepped too far into something you cannot understand." The medic's blood ran cold. This wasn't a soldier with orders. It was something with purpose. The figure's eyes glowed faintly beneath its helmet, an eerie, almost unnatural light. The medic didn't flinch, even as the being advanced toward them with such a calculated step that every movement seemed deliberate, predatory. I don't understand what you want, the medic growled, trying to keep his voice steady. His gaze shifted to the girl, barely holding on, her breathing shallow and erratic. But I'll fight for her, and I'll fight for humanity. The figure's laugh, if it could even be called a laugh, was soft, unsettling. It didn't respond right away. Instead, it took another step forward, the tension building in the air with each measured move. Then, just as the medic braced himself for an impossible battle, the figure stopped and spoke again, its voice now laced with something like curiosity. You think this is about her, don't you? The medic's grip tightened around his weapon, but before he could react, the figure raised a hand, and the ground beneath them seemed to shift. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the medic's bones as if some invisible force was pushing at them from all sides. The medic staggered, caught off guard, as the girl let out a sharp gasp, her eyes widening in fear. Suddenly, the medic understood. The figure wasn't an enemy soldier at all. It wasn't here to hunt them. It was here to test them. The realization hit him like a freight train. This being was not a soldier, not an invader, but something much older. It was an agent sent to observe, to assess. It had been watching them all along. The battles they had fought, the sacrifices they had made, they weren't random. They had been part of a much larger, much darker plan. You're testing us? The medic asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure nodded slowly, its form shimmering slightly in the dim light. Indeed, human. We have been observing you for a long time. You and your kind, you don't realize it yet, but you've already surpassed expectations. The girl you protect, the reason you fight, was never the true purpose. The medic's confusion deepened. What do you mean? She's everything. She's the one I'm trying to save. The figure tilted its head slightly. You still don't understand. She's part of the test, yes. But the real test was always you. Humanity. Your kind's ability to endure, to fight against the odds. You've passed, human. You've passed the hardest test of all. The medic's world seemed to shatter in that instant. The girl, whose life he had been desperately trying to save, wasn't the key to everything. It was humanity itself. They were the test subjects. But what kind of test could possibly involve so much destruction, so much chaos? The medic's mind raced as he tried to comprehend the meaning of the figure's words. Before he could form another thought, the figure took a step back and raised its hand, signaling a sudden change. The ground stopped shaking, the vibrations fading as the noise of the battlefield around them dulled. The silence was deafening. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, everything seemed to shift. The medic's weapon, his only defense, dropped from his hands, rendered useless by the wave of energy that had flooded the area. He looked around, and to his shock, the enemy soldiers had disappeared, leaving nothing behind but the wreckage of the battle. The figure's glowing eyes focused on the medic one last time. You are free to go. The test has ended. But know this, your survival was never guaranteed. You've proven yourselves worthy for now. And then, just like that, the figure was gone, disappearing into the fading light of the ruined city. The medic stood frozen, a mix of disbelief and relief washing over him. He wanted to collapse to his knees, but his eyes fell upon the girl in his arms. She was still breathing, weak but alive, and that was enough for him. But as he caught his breath, something inside him shifted. There was a new understanding now, a realization that he hadn't truly grasped before. They had been part of something much bigger than themselves, part of a test, an experiment that would determine the fate of their world. It had been a trial by fire, and humanity had passed. But the truth left him with more questions than answers. Who had orchestrated this test? What did it mean for their future? And then, as the first rays of dawn began to break through the smoke-filled sky, a final chilling thought crossed his mind. This test, this war, had been only the beginning. There was much more ahead, far darker and more dangerous than he could have imagined. The medic looked down at the alien girl in his arms, and for the first time, he realized the true weight of their survival. They had won this battle, but the war, in the grand scheme of things, was just getting started. And no one knew what would come next. I'm unable to generate the entire 10,000 words in a single response, but I can continue the story from where we left off in a more manageable amount. Let me provide the continuation of the story in sections. Here's the next part. As the first rays of dawn broke through the darkened sky, the medic was still standing, his mind racing. The alien girl, still cradled in his arms, stirred slightly, but remained unconscious. Her shallow breathing was the only sign that she was alive. In that moment, he realized how much he had taken for granted, how fragile life truly was. Yet, despite everything that had happened, there was a strange calm that washed over him. They had survived the impossible. They had passed the test, but it wasn't over. Not yet. The medic shifted his gaze to the horizon, trying to make sense of everything. The battle, the overwhelming odds, and the mysterious figure that had vanished into the ether. It all felt like a dream. But the remnants of the destruction around them, burned out buildings, craters in the ground, and the twisted wreckage of fallen soldiers were very real. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something far greater. For humanity's place in the universe. The girl's life was still hanging in the balance, and the medic knew he couldn't waste another second. With no time to mourn the destruction around them, he adjusted his grip on her and began to move through the ruins, looking for shelter. He didn't know where to go or what awaited them, but he couldn't stop now. She needed help, and he had sworn to keep her safe. The path ahead was uncertain. Each step carried them deeper into the wreckage of what had once been a thriving city. The air smelled of smoke, and the dust that hung in the air made every breath feel like it was tearing at his lungs. But still, he pressed on, focused on the girl. His mind raced, remembering the figure's cryptic words. They had passed the test. But what came next? What were they really up against? It wasn't long before the medic found an abandoned structure, a half-collapsed building that offered enough cover to keep them out of sight. He was about to set the girl down when he felt something stir in his chest. It wasn't just fear, but something deeper, something he had never quite been able to put into words before. He knew what they had survived was extraordinary, but he also knew it wasn't enough. Humanity had passed their first test, but there were more to come, and they would need more than survival skills to face what was ahead. As he settled the girl down on a bed of rubble and started working on stabilizing her condition, a low rumble echoed through the streets. At first, he thought it was another explosion, but this was different. The ground seemed to vibrate beneath him, and the buildings around them groaned, as if something heavy was moving closer. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. His instincts told him to move quickly, but he was too late. A figure appeared at the entrance of the ruins, and this time there was no mistaking it. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't a mysterious agent from before. It was something else, entirely something far more terrifying. The figure was tall, its skin a deep, metallic hue that shimmered in the dim light. It wore an armored suit, but the contours of its face were barely visible through the helmet, and what the medic could make out sent chills down his spine. There was an intelligence in its eyes, a cold, calculating intelligence that seemed to peer into his very soul. The medic's grip tightened on the weapon at his side, but he knew it wouldn't matter. This wasn't a fight they could win. But to his surprise, the figure didn't attack. It simply stood there, watching him. And then, in a voice so deep that it vibrated the very air, it spoke. "You've made it this far, human," the figure said, its voice like the hum of an ancient machine. "But the true test is yet to come." The medic's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. "What do you want from us?" The figure stepped forward, its presence overwhelming. "We are the Watchers," it said, its voice now colder, more detached. "We've observed your kind for millennia. We've studied your potential, your survival, your strength. It's all part of the greater design." The medic took a step back, heart hammering in his chest. "What do you mean?" "We're just trying to survive." The Watcher's eyes narrowed. "Survival is just the beginning. You were never meant to remain here on this world. Your evolution has been guided. Everything you've experienced, every hardship you've faced it, has all been leading to this moment." The medic's mind spun. "Guided? By whom?" "By us," the Watcher replied simply. "You are part of an experiment. Your kind was seeded here, a test to see if you could survive long enough to join us. To ascend." The words hit the medic like a physical blow. He stumbled back, eyes wide in shock. "An experiment," he whispered. "You've been watching us." The Watcher nodded. "For centuries. And you've done well, human. You've surpassed our expectations." "But the girl?" the medic asked, his voice shaking. She's not part of this." "No," the Watcher replied. "She is an anomaly. A survivor, like you. But her existence is irrelevant to the greater plan. Your species, however, is not. We've seen potential in you, human, and we have been preparing you. The future of your kind depends on what happens next." The medic's thoughts raced, but his focus never wavered from the girl. The Watcher was talking about things far beyond his comprehension, but he didn't care. He had a duty. He had to protect her, no matter what. "The test isn't over yet, human," the Watcher said, its voice colder than before. "There will be more trials, more obstacles. The true test of humanity's worth is still to come." With that, the Watcher turned and began to walk away, its footsteps echoing through the ruined city. The medic stared after it, the weight of the words sinking in. There was no clear answer, no easy way out. Humanity's fate hung in the balance, and it was up to him to guide them through the coming darkness. He turned back to the girl, now stabilizing but still unconscious. She was his responsibility, and in that moment, he knew that the world had changed. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their future. The Watchers had shown them the truth, and it was up to humanity to decide what came next. But for now, all he could do was wait and prepare. There was much more to come, and this was just the beginning.